Isabella, what is a CAFO?
Large indoor or outdoor structures that allocate a very small amount of space to each animal.
I don't know where you read that. But anyway, CAFO is in bold on the bottom of page 300. Concentrated animal feeding operation. You might call that a feedlot if you're talking about cows or maybe pigs. If you're talking about chickens, those would be in or chickens or turkeys or really any kind of poultry. Those would probably be in a chicken house or a turkey house. So those are large feeding operations where you got a lot of animals in a small area and you're feeding them a bunch of stuff and you're trying to grow them out really quickly. Now, is anybody in here that wants to admit it, vegan or vegetarian?
I am.
Anyone? Anyone? Are you really? Obviously not. So, all of us in here eat some type of meat, and that meat has to come from some animal somewhere. And so, things that I want you to consider when we're discussing meat production. Where does this come from? How are the animals treated? What's the environmental impact? You getting all this down, Jacayla? What are the costs? Not only cost at the store, but other costs related to that. So these are things that we need to consider when we're talking about animal production. And hopefully, as you guys get bigger and older and smarter and wiser, these are things that you will consider with. How do you get to vote on the type of foods that you have at the supermarket? Did y'all know you get to vote on the type of foods at the supermarket? You know how? Simona? I expect you to know this one. Anthony's? You vote with what you buy. So what you buy at the supermarket is how you vote. So if everybody's at the supermarket buying up all the organic food, come on, Simona, don't you work at Publix?
That's what I was going to say. I didn't want to get it wrong.
Well, I mean, what happens if you get it wrong? The worst, literally the worst thing
You made fun of me.
that could happen if you got it wrong is me make fun of you and hit this no button. And that's just fun. That's not a bad thing. Don't be afraid to fail. Am I right, Isabella? I think there's a book by that name. Don't be afraid to fail. That means you're trying.
There's a book?
Probably. Not, I should write it. All right. So, don't be afraid to fail, Simona. How about that? So, where are we going with it? Oh, yeah. So, what you're going to see at the supermarket is going to be determined by what you buy. If everybody's buying organic, then they're going to start stocking more organic stuff. If everybody's not buying organic because they don't want to pay that extra $1 or $2, then they're going to stop stocking the organic stuff. So they are going to stock what people buy. Isn't that right, Simona? For the most part. So we get to determine that. So you have to determine how you're going to base your purchases. Are you doing it because of how expensive it is, how it tastes, what's the environmental effects, what's the effect on long-term sustainability? These are all things that you have to consider as you grow up and be big boys and big girls. So, feedlots, what are some characteristics? One, they're overcrowded. If you're at the top of page 301, feedlots can have 2,500 hogs in one building, 55,000 turkeys. And if they can fit 55,000 turkeys, they can probably fit 100,000 chickens in a chicken house. I don't know. Y'all can check me on that one. Cows. Some of these large cattle lots can have tens of thousands or maybe even 100,000 cattle in a very small area. They're all pretty close to one another. They're all walking around pooping and peeing the whole time. And they're basically just sitting there eating grain almost all the entire time. They're eating corn, soybeans, and probably some minerals. Trying to fatten them up and muscle them up and get them off to market. So, it is quicker in a feedlot situation. You can grow stuff much quicker. I think chickens, you can get those 40-something days. You can get them from start to finish. That's a quick turnaround for a bird. I mean, our birds that we've had out there, they've been out there since the 1st of September, October. They've been 70, 75 days. I mean, we could probably eat them right now, but they wouldn't be very big. It wouldn't make a light snack for most of us. Right, Reagan? So that chicken leg wouldn't be much to bite onto. So in order to grow them that quickly, you have to have certain types of chickens. You have to feed them a lot, and you have to have them eating around the clock. All right, feed grain. Most of them are fed grain. Now, what do cows normally eat in the wild? I mean, like wherever cows came from, oxen, whatnot. Okay, so they would have been eating grasses. Now, grasses, what do they eat in feedlot? Corn and grain. What do you think that does to their bodies?
Make them big.
Well, it makes them big quick. Now, they can get big. Well, I'll turn that off. Cows can get big eating grass. It just takes a little bit longer. So that eating grain quickens the process. One of the biggest problems that we'll talk about in a second is when you feed them all that like corn and soybeans and stuff and it's their stomach, normally they're eating grass and they chew it and they break it down and they throw it up and they chew it some more and they break it down. Well, the corn is bad for their intestine, their gut a lot of times. A lot of times they'll get sick. Kind of like we would get an ulcer or something. What do you take when you get an ulcer? Most of the time, antibiotics are prescribed. So what happens to cows when they get sick at their stomach? Antibiotics, good. So lots of antibiotics are used in order to keep these cows from getting sick. Now, what happens if you were running this feedlot, Jacayla, and a cow got sick? What would be your biggest concern? Other cows getting sick. They're all close together, and they're eating and drinking out of the same trough and water, and they're all stepping in each other's poo, rolling around. And so that might be a problem if you, if one of them got sick, you might expect a lot of them to get sick. And that's a lot of money right there. Right there. If you had, 100,000 cows and each one of those jokers is worth $1,000 or more, you're talking about like $100 million operation. Y'all can check my math on that one. But that's a lot of money that you would be afraid of losing. So that's going to be an issue in a second. Let's see what else. They make lots of waste. So they eat a lot of food. They poop a lot, which can contaminate ground and surface water. When you have a large amount of animals in a small area, where does all that waste go? There's not a sewage treatment plant for it. They may have a sewage pond. But if it rains a large amount, like 2 or 3 inches, I mean, you're going to have a lot of runoff, which could be a problem. It is much cheaper to do it this way, which is why it's done this way, because everything's about money. But the biggest issue, going back to feeding grain and having that many animals in a small area, is the worry of an outbreak of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So antibiotics are used to kill what? Bacteria. Good job. And if you get some of these cows sick, and here's what's going on. They're mass feeding them and mixing in antibiotics with their feed. They do this so they don't get what? Sick and die and then pass it on to other animals. The problem that occurs here, in recent years, you've seen this in people. When you go to the doctor's office, they're real stingy now about passing out antibiotics, because people mistook them for years. They took too many of them, and what we've done is we've created a bunch of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And if it gets to the point where antibiotics don't work on a bacteria, then you've got a problem, because you really have no good way of fighting it off if it's that strong, okay? So that's a big concern. Like, if you get some antibiotics from the doctor, what do they tell you to do with them?
Take them daily.
Take them daily, what else? What are other instructions?
In the fridge.
Okay, sometimes in the fridge. What else?
Don't take too many.
Y'all are the only class that didn't get this. Take them to what? To your well? What?
Till it's empty. 2 weeks.
Yeah, usually they say take them till they're empty, or maybe 10 days or 2 weeks. Never in the history of ever have I heard a doctor say, take them till you feel better and stop taking your antibiotics. Why is that, DeMar?
Because it still, even though you feel better, it can still be in your system.
Yeah, I mean, let's say you feel better after 3 days and you stop taking your antibiotics, and let's say those antibiotics killed 90% of the bacteria in your system. Well, what about the other 10%? Those 10% are obviously the strongest individuals out of the bunch. Now you've stopped taking the antibiotic. Those can start to repopulate, or maybe those are the ones that you pass on to someone else. And if that continues to happen, basically what will occur long run is the antibiotics won't be effective because those really resistant bacteria won't respond to them. And then you got some serious problems when you can't use your antibiotics, okay? All right, next thing. Meat production is inefficient. Inefficient meaning in terms of how much food we actually get out of it, like calorie-wise, okay? Let me roll this down here a little bit. I can't see a couple people's faces until they're giving me dirty looks. Let's see. I don't want it to be so low as it sees, you can see at my nose, but I don't want it to be so high that I can't see the people in the back. Hold on a second. How's that? Close enough. So, meat production, inefficient. It takes roughly 20 times as much land to make the same amount of calories from meat as it does plants. So Isabella, if you had 10 acres, and on that 10 acres, you were growing corn and beans and some different produce crops, and then you needed to produce so many calories per month to feed your family. Reagan, if you were growing cattle and sheep and goats on your piece of land, how much land would you have to produce or have to produce the same amount of calories as Isabella on her 10 acres? 200 acres. Now, that's kind of an estimate because cattle, I think, are much higher than chickens. Chickens, you get a little better return on investment there in terms of feeding them and how much meat they actually produce. But beef cattle, it's quite a bit. And that's where a lot of our production goes, a lot of our grain goes. So that's a big problem right there is it takes a lot of land to grow enough food to feed those animals. So what does the future of meat production look like, Simona? You think in 50 years meat's going to be as cheap as it is now? You can go home and eat a steak every night for dinner? The answer is probably no, because the more time goes on, there's going to be more people, which means less land, and also means, what about food? How are we going to produce enough food? It's much easier to produce a lot of food if you're growing produce than it is if you're growing animals, just because the animals take so much. Where does that, if you feed those animals a bunch of corn, where does most of that energy go? Most of it's lost as? I remember that whole trophic level thing, and as you go up the trophic level, you lose energy from when you go from one to the next. What are you losing energy in the form of? Simona? Don't be afraid. Heat, yes. 90% of that energy is lost as heat. Y'all remember that conversation? Lord help us all. All right. Free range. What does it mean to be a free range animal, Kayla? It means you're not stuck in a cage somewhere. Free range is really, I would say, subjective, because we have chickens, and technically going on the definition for how they define free range eggs, ours are considered free range, even though they're still in a pen. They're in a pretty big pen, probably about the size of this room, but it has a net over it and has a fence around it to keep predators out. So in the sense, are they allowed to willy-nilly run around and do whatever they want to? No, but they do have quite a bit of room to run around outside. So anyway, free-range animals, or for cows, that would be more like just pasture-fed all the way up to the point of consumption. Like my dad raises cows on a pasture up until the calves are probably 300 or 400 pounds, and then he sells them. It's a cow sale. At the cow sale, people from these feedlots will come, they'll bid and buy them. They take them off, they take them to the feedlot, and they feed them grain, corn and soybeans and whatever else until they're big enough to slaughter. So that's a quick, cheaper way of going about growing them out. If my dad grew them out all the way to the point where they were big enough to to be that size, it would take a lot of time and a lot of pasture. So the problem with free ranging or pasture fed is it's expensive, it requires more land, and it requires more time, okay? So those are issues you have to think about in terms of when you're buying food at the store. Are you okay with paying $1.60 for eggs that were grown by some chicken that was living in a cage about 1.5 feet wide, about 1.5 feet tall, and about 1.5 feet high her entire life? Or are you willing to pay $4 or $5 for free range or organic eggs that were grown with a chicken that gets to go run around outside? It's not cooped up, no pun intended, and has a better life and probably has better food to eat, and I don't know, probably just overall better way of doing things. Are we willing to pay extra? That's a good question. Maybe we just stop wasting so much food, and then the food we buy, we make sure we get like good, rich, organic, quality food, and just not buy as much. That's a novel idea. What do you think, Isabella?
Sounds good.
I feel like we waste a lot of food in the cafeteria.
What makes you think that? What would your solution be to that? Because they put food on people's plates, right?
I know a solution to it.
What?
The free lunch, how it works, or like, you know how there's that program where you could get it down to a certain amount based off of your income?
Is anybody having to pay for lunch right now?
No.
No.
But now it's free. And for example, in order for you to have a free lunch, you have to get one thing
Of each?
of each thing. But what if you don't want to eat that thing? You end up just throwing it away.
I mean, why do you think they make them do that?
I just feel like they need to not give people free reign to get whatever they want to a certain extent, because, or at least make it like one meal per person.
They don't scoop the food, but it's pre-portioned.
It's like, yeah,
it's in like boxes.
Yeah, so then that makes people want to get more than what they can possibly eat, and then once they don't eat it, then it's like wasted food. Like it should be just one like meal per person instead of like the option to get 2 or 3 extra meals.
Can you get 2 or 3 extra?
If you want to, yeah.
But I mean, aren't you having to pay for the extra?
Yeah, but still, I'm like, so like, since one meal is already free, you're technically paying for one meal.
Oh, if you get 2?
Mm-hmm. So it's just $2.
Charge people more than is what you're saying.
Yeah, if they're gonna get extra food, then they need to just go ahead and start back making us pay for lunch. So that way it's like,
Maybe we should just start fining people for not cleaning their plates.
No,
Can we get like a thought police in there that will go around and watch people, maybe a computer program, and when they don't finish their plates, then they get charged extra. It costs less the more you eat. That might pose some other problems though, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what happens when people eat more than they want to?
Someone got food poisoning last week from eating the food.
Who got food poisoning?
One of our friends in our grade. I don't know if he had
Where did they get the food from?
the cafeteria.
It probably came from Publix. All right. You're probably just trying to put it off on the cafeteria.
Publix has good food.
Oh, yeah. I think Publix has the best food as far as I'm concerned. In terms of like produce and whatnot, yes. And to be honest, I think Publix is cheaper than just about anywhere else. I mean, like when I go in and shop at Publix, I only get 2-for-1 deals. And like it just drives me insane when my wife's like, yeah, I'm going to the grocery store, what can I get you? And I'm like, well, get some ice cream if it's 2-for-1. And then she'll get home and have ice cream, and I was like, well, this is half off? She's like, I don't know. I'm like, who shops like that? What kind of world are we living in here? Just only buy it if it's half off. That's part of the reason why it tastes so good, is because it was cheap. If I see 2-for-1, I'm grabbing it. Well, if I like it.
At a grocery store.
No, I'm saying
You have
to be in a shopping. Go to
Where?
Oh, yeah.
It's like behind,
If you don't,
over there,
That's why I
one of
got
the
my
shop
shop.
almost. Like in
You spend extra.
I try to stay out of the wine section. Okay.
One more thing.
One more thing.
One more thing.
Go.
So I don't ever go to the North Port one, but I went to the North Port one yesterday, and I found out there was a whole whole jelly bean section.
Oh yeah, you didn't know that?
No.
I'm kidding.
Well, things are better in the 06. Did you see any rainbows and unicorns on the way there? Because that's what I hear.
There was a rainbow this weekend.
I've said too much to be on the internet. All right. Overgrazing. So here's another issue. I've been watching this video online. It's called Regreening the Desert. You people at home, it'd be a good what for y'all to watch in your spare time instead of playing on the Twitter or seeing how many streaks you have on Snapple Chat. But a lot of this regreening the desert is this concept of you can take desert area, and as long as it gets a little bit of rainfall, now most deserts get like less than 10 inches, even if it's getting like 8 to 10. Like, you can take that area and you can, if with the proper development, taking animals off that land, letting it rain, whatever it's going to rain, let those crops and stuff grow, coming in, bringing in stuff that is drought tolerant, planting it, and you can get those areas to regreen and regrow. They had a really good example of this in China. In northern China, they had a place that had been like farmed and grazed for like hundreds of years. And it had just basically turned into like a desert wasteland. It looked horrible. I mean, it just looked like a desert. It was probably like originally like a dry grassland or shrubland like chaparral, where it maybe got 10, 20 inches of rain at the most. And so they went in, they took all the grazing animals off that land. They contoured the land where it would hold moisture, and they like made terraces on the hillsides and stuff so moisture would gather. They used, they planted whatever they could, and they just over a few years, they were able to build a lot of organic matter, and it looked like at the end of 3 years, the whole place had turned green. And going from this area that looked like it was just all brown desert and nothing would grow there. So it is possible to regreen some of these areas where they're still getting some rainfall. The problem with overgrazing is this. When you graze your animals too much, you lose your vegetation. Once you lose your vegetation and it rains, what happens to the soil? It runs off. It washes away. So now, once you've overgrazed, you've lost your vegetation, you've lost your soil, and what's going to grow there? Nothing. If you don't have any organic material and any topsoil in place, and it's mostly just either rock or hard clay or sand, you're not going to get stuff to grow there. So that's a big issue. That process is called desertification, where you basically turn an area that was kind of dry into a desert because of dry conditions and poor farming practices. But good news is, if you're committed, you can turn those areas around. Although I'm worried that we're not very committed. I think we're more committed to building a base on Mars and trying to grow stuff up there over the next 1,000 years than we are fixing some of the problems we've caused here on Earth. So, turn to page 524. 524. Try to finish Biggest Little Farm today. On 524, we're going to get into one other issue here, 525, related to meat consumption. In order to grow that much grain, grow those animals, transport that grain, transport those animals, it requires a lot of greenhouse gases. When you reduce your meat consumption, you're going to reduce the amount of CO2 produced because of you're reducing all this travel and production of grains. You're also going to, and this is opposed to like meat production, like saying if you switched more toward producing fruits, vegetables, plant-based material, more plant materials, okay? Now, I'm not advocating that we stop producing meat, okay? That's not what I'm saying here. I'm just saying that when we produce lots of meat, there are environmental consequences, and we have to think about that. Also, meat produces, any kind of animals that produce meat produces a lot of methane. Like have you ever seen those videos online when somebody like toots and they try to light it on fire? You know what I'm talking about? Reagan's the only one that's seen this. Reagan, why does it light on fire? What's that toot made out of mostly? Methane, which would be natural gas coming into your house. Basically, it's the same thing. And cows produce a lot of that. And I think they actually produce more coming out the front end than they do the back end. I think that where there's a Mythbusters we'll watch when we get to energy and talk about that. But anyway, there's roughly, I don't know, 1 billion or so cows on the planet. There's about, I think, 700 million-ish in India. So there's a lot of cows on the planet. Cows are big. Cows produce lots of methane. That's another greenhouse gas. Methane is actually a worse greenhouse gas per like particle than carbon dioxide. We just happen to produce a lot more carbon dioxide. Another greenhouse gas it talks about is nitrous oxide, which is used in fossil fuel consumption. They've got some of these over, I think they go through this cycle on 523. And we'll also talk about nitrous oxide gas when we get to talking about acid rain. So another issue there when you're using lots and lots of fossil fuels, which it requires for meat production. Okay, y'all get out your biggest little farm video questions. Oh yeah, I totally forgot when y'all got in here. Y'all stopped me 5 minutes early and we need to water your plants and check your plants. We're gonna turn those in tomorrow if you've got good data. If you are not gonna be here tomorrow, then you can turn that in on Monday. But you're going to, your salinity lab, you're going to finish collecting your data, you're going to graph it and draw some conclusions and then turn that in, okay? Any questions? Ah, come on, man.